Week 10 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few defense DST units. I looked at off the wire this week. The first one, the Las Vegas Raiders. So the Raiders, their defense played well, obviously, versus a weak New York Giant team that gives up the most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So this Raider team, another good matchup coming up right now, available in 51% of fantasy leagues. And they got a good matchup versus the New York Jets. They give up the 8th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So the last few weeks, the Raiders have gone out there and played good football. Week 8 versus Detroit, 26 points, allowed a sack, a pick six, 2 fumble recoveries. Week 9 versus the Giants, 6 points, allowed 8 sacks and 2 INTs. And this week here with a great matchup, like I mentioned, versus the New York Jets, that their offense is one of the worst offenses in the league because of Zach Wilson being one of the worst quarterbacks in the league as well. I know they got Breece Hall, Gavin Wilson, 2 talented players, but this offense just can't move the football well, and they can't find the end zone a lot. So right now with this Raider team playing good football and a team coming from the East Coast to the West Coast over there in Vegas is always a problem. I think this Raider team for the third week in a row could have another solid ball game, and they're available right now 51% of fantasy leagues. Next DST is the Seattle Seahawks. So the Seahawks out there in the decent amount of leagues as well, 59%. I know they got the doors blown off for them in Week 9 at Baltimore. 37 points, allowed a sack, 2 fumble recoveries, but a good matchup here in Week 10 versus the Commanders coming to town. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So right now we know they got a good defense, is the Seattle team. We know the 12th man is going to be behind them. And this Commander running game really isn't there, so they're pretty much a one-dimensional team for the most part, even though Sam Howell's been pretty impressive this season as the quarterback for this Commander team. So right now, Seattle out there in 59% of fantasy leagues. We've seen some big games out of them, but I know it was a bad game last week in Week 9. But I think they bounced back, and they were in ad this week. The next DST is the Indianapolis Colts. So the Colts, they were a streaming option last week and had a great game at the Carolina Panthers, where that 13 points, allowed 4 sacks, 3 INTs, including 2 pick sixes in that game. And Week 10, a Germany game for them and the New England Patriots. So this Indianapolis Colts team, they really didn't get added in many fantasy leagues. Out there in tons right now in 86%. So this week with a good matchup, I think they could get to Mac Jones a few times, create some turnovers as well on Mac Jones. I would give this Indianapolis Colts team an ad, and like I said, as a streaming option, I think they could go out there and make some plays. So this week, their pickup off the wire. The next DST is the Atlanta Falcons. So the Falcons, they're middle of the pack type of defense on the season. We know they could get to the quarterback a little. We know for the most part they keep the scoring low, even though the last 2 weeks they have got shredded by Will Levis and Joshua Dobbs. But this week here, good matchup at the Arizona Cardinals. I know Kyler Murray possibly could be back in this game for this Cardinal team. We know Clayton Tune couldn't get anything going at all versus the Cleveland Browns. If Murray's ready, I think he's going to start in this one. I'm not saying he's going to go out there and put up a big game, because I still think the Falcons get to Murray. Their offensive line isn't all that great. They're pretty limited offensively, is this Cardinal team. And right now, I just think Atlanta is a decent option. Available right now, 50% of fantasy leagues as a streamer. Is an ad this week in the 5th and final defense DST unit. I looked at it off the wires. The Chicago Bears. I know the Bears defense really hasn't been good at all this season, but as a streaming option this week versus a weak offense as well in the Carolina Panthers that give up the 9th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. I think the Bears defense could go out there. They can make a few plays. We just saw a Colt defense have 2 pick sixes and score over 25 fantasy points on the defensive end for fantasy owners. And right now, like I said, this Bear team, Thursday Night Football, short week and a tough game it was for the rookie Bryce Young. I think once again, this Bear team could go in there and make some plays. Out there in 98% of fantasy leagues, that's a few defense DST units. I looked at it off the wire for Week 10 of the fantasy football season.